The wind in Castellamare del Golfo didn't howl, it whispered. It came down off the mountains in the early morning and ran its fingers through olive trees, down to the sea where the fishermen worked with quiet hands. That town, so small on the map, was everything to Stefano Magaddino. He was born there, under the crooked shadow of a crumbling stone church that hadn't rung its bell in months. He remembered the way the sunlight hit the altar through stained glass, turning the dust into gold. It was the only beauty left in a place that was bleeding men by the year, to war, to America, to the vendettas no priest could stop. Stefano's father was a gravedigger, not in the poetic way. He literally dug holes and lowered caskets. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was always to remind Stefano of one thing. You can't outrun death, so you better learn to work with it. The first body Stefano saw wasn't in a coffin. It was in the street, a butcher shot in broad daylight over a goat that wasn't his. Nobody cried. Nobody even looked surprised. His blood mixed with the dust like it belonged there. This was Sicily in the late 1800s. There were no police, not really. Just men with guns, men with codes, and men who chose silence if they wanted to live past 30. By 16, Stefano already had eyes that made grown men uncomfortable. Still, black, like he was already looking past you, reading the page after you're dead. He never talked about his older brother's disappearance, but everyone in town whispered that it was Stefano who settled that score. They whispered that he didn't use a gun, just a blade in his bare hands. Nobody ever confirmed it. But after that, nobody laid a finger on the Magaddino family again. But Sicily was changing, not for the better. There were too many enemies now, too many families with too many sons, all fighting over scraps like starving dogs. The bosses couldn't hold the peace, and even the old codes were falling apart. Stefano saw the writing on the wall. A man with his kind of mind, calm, calculating, never speaking more than needed. He knew when it was time to leave a dying house. So when the letter came from America, Buffalo, New York, from his cousin, Joseph Bonanno, offering a way out and a new beginning, Stefano packed one suitcase and didn't look back. He left in the middle of the night, not even saying goodbye to the graves he helped dig. The port of Palermo was cold that morning, the kind of cold that sinks into your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Men shouted, wood creaked under boots, and the smell of seawater mixed with oil and coal. The ship was nothing more than rust and prayers, but it floated, and that was enough. Stefano didn't look nervous. He stood by the rail in silence, watching the Sicilian coastline disappear behind the fog, as if the island itself was relieved to be rid of him. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just muttered something in Sicilian under his breath, something about dead and destiny, and lit a cigarette with fingers that didn't shake. America didn't know his name yet, but it would. The ship creaked and moaned like an old man in pain, rocking gently across the Atlantic. For Stefano Magaddino, the days at sea weren't marked by the calendar, but by the smells. The first was coal. Thick and sharp, it clung to everything. Then came the sea, wet, salty, sour, and finally, the smell of men packed together below deck. Sweat, vomit, unwashed skin, fear. They called it steerage, but it felt more like a prison with hope nailed to the wall. Stefano didn't complain. He slept near the bulkhead, in a corner where no one dared sit. He was quiet, but not in the shy way. The other men avoided his gaze, not because they knew who he was, but because something in his eyes told them not to ask. He moved like someone who'd already made peace with violence. He didn't flinch at shouting. He didn't smile at kindness. He simply waited. One Sicilian man, a baker from Agrigento, tried to start a conversation. Told him about a cousin who ran a shop in Brooklyn, talked about freedom, about ambition, about how America was a land where a man could become something without blood on his hands. Stefano listened, nodding once or twice. But when the baker asked what he would do in America, Stefano's answer was flat. I will bury the old world and make a place for the new. After that, no one else asked him anything. The journey lasted 13 days. 13 long, aching days where men stared at the ceiling and wondered if they'd ever breathe clean air again. Stefano watched the ocean roll like a living beast. He didn't sleep much. He didn't need to. He had time. When the ship finally rolled into New York Harbor, men pressed against the rails like they were seeing heaven. The Statue of Liberty loomed through the fog, green and massive, holding that torch like a silent promise. Some men cried, others kissed their crucifixes. But Stefano didn't react. He just took out a fresh cigarette and lit it with a match that didn't tremble. Ellis Island wasn't freedom, not yet. It was noise and lines and more questions than answers. The inspectors barked in English, a language that chewed words like meat. Mothers clutched their babies. Men fumbled with papers. They were poked, examined, stamped, numbered. When it was Stefano's turn, the inspector asked for his name. Stefano Magaddino. He pronounced it slowly, like it was the first word he ever learned. The inspector squinted at him. Any relatives here? Joseph Bonanno, my cousin. The name carried weight. Bonanno was already building something in New York. Small, quiet, but growing. Stefano didn't mention what Joseph really did. He didn't have to. The inspector didn't push, just scribbled something and waved him through. Just like that, Stefano stepped into America. Buffalo wasn't what he expected. He thought New York would be tall buildings, gold streets, and suits with silk ties. But Buffalo was cold, gray, and wet. It smelled of soot, slaughterhouses, and river rot. The buildings leaned like old drunks. The roads were mud in the spring and ice in the winter. It felt like Sicily if someone had sucked all the color out. But Stefano liked it. It was quiet. And quiet meant opportunity. His cousin Joseph had set up shop in Williamsville, a small neighborhood near the edge of the city. Not flashy, not dangerous, just a place where men moved quietly and didn't ask questions. Joseph greeted him like family, or because he was, but even in his hug, Stefano felt attention, not fear, respect. I heard about your brother, Joseph said once they were alone. Stefano didn't respond. He just nodded once. Joseph changed the subject. I have men here, Sicilians, some Calabrians too. They're loyal but undisciplined. Buffalo's open. The Irish have politics. The Germans have banks. But the street? He smirked. The street is empty. We could own it. Stefano took a deep breath. The air smelled like wood smoke and blood sausage. Different from Sicily, but not unfamiliar. Then we take it, he said, voice calm as ever. At first, Stefano kept quiet. He watched. That's what he was good at. He'd sit in the back of butcher shops while men came in with questions. He'd nod while Joseph handled the small-time bookies and union men. But every time a decision had to be made, a real one, Joseph would glance at Stefano, and Stefano would give a look, just one. And the room would know what needed to be done. The first time Stefano made his move, it wasn't loud. A local thug named Eddie Kravitz, a Polish loan shark with no real sense of boundaries, had started leaning on Sicilian grocers, asking for fees, threatening wives. A few of the men came to Joseph complaining. Joseph hesitated. Kravitz was protected, not by the police, but by his cousin in the city council. But Stefano, he didn't hesitate. One cold night in late October, Stefano walked into Kravitz's bar alone. No gun, no backup, just him and that look in his eyes. The bartender recognized him and froze. Kravitz looked up from his whiskey, confused. You lost, Dago? He smirked. Stefano didn't answer. He walked straight to him, sat down at the table, and picked up Kravitz's glass. This is my neighborhood now, he said slowly, like each word weighed a pound. And I don't share. Kravitz laughed. He stood. Big man, broad, dumb. He didn't even see the blade. Stefano slipped it in beneath the ribs, quick, deep, and with precision that came from experience, not panic. Kravitz dropped to his knees before he even bled. The bartender backed away. Nobody screamed. Stefano stood, wiped the blade on Kravitz's coat, and walked out. That was the first lesson Buffalo learned about Stefano Magaddino. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need an army. He just needed silence and a reason. In the months that followed, Stefano became more than just Joseph's cousin. He became the one men came to when they wanted something done right. Quiet hits, hard talks, disappearances, everything wrapped in respect and done clean. He never left a mess. He also did something different, something the other bosses didn't expect. He started buying funeral homes. The first one was a rundown parlor near Niagara Street, the kind of place where old Italians whispered prayers and candles burned low. He cleaned it up, painted the walls, put a Sicilian flag behind the altar, hired only trusted men, and slowly, he made it the center of his empire. That's when they started calling him the Undertaker, because Stefano Magaddino didn't just run funerals. He ran the business of death. If someone needed to disappear, he knew how to make it clean. If someone needed to be warned, they'd get flowers from the funeral home. No card, just lilies. Even the cops didn't push too hard. Some of them had brothers buried under Stefano's crosses. Some owed him money. Others just knew better than to knock on the wrong door. But Stefano didn't grow by fear alone. He built structure. He gave every man a job, every man a cut. He punished disloyalty with silence and reward. If someone crossed him, he didn't yell, he didn't chase, he just nodded. And a week later, that man would vanish, or end up in a casket with their shoes off. That was his way. But power always draws enemies. There were whispers now. Other families, especially in New York, didn't like how quickly Stefano was rising. He wasn't flashy, but he was expanding, taking territory, controlling unions. Even Chicago had started to pay attention, and Joseph Bonanno, the cousin who brought him in, started to feel the heat. They were family, but even blood can't stop ambition from turning sour. Late one night, over espresso and rain against the window, Joseph leaned in. "You've done good, Stefano. Buffalo listens to you, but we need to stay small." "Keep quiet." Stefano stirred his drink. "Quiet is a choice," he said, "but not when wolves circle." Joseph's hand tightened around the cup. "We're not ready for war." Stefano looked him dead in the eye. "Then don't start one with me." The silence between them said everything. By the end of that year, Stefano Magaddino wasn't just a man anymore. He was a presence. People crossed the street when he walked past, not because he looked dangerous. He didn't. He wore simple suits, moved slow, spoke softer than most. But there was something in him that felt eternal, like he'd seen the inside of too many graves to ever be surprised again. The Sicilian boy who watched his first murder in the dusty streets of Castellamare had become something bigger in America. And he wasn't done, not even close. The snow came early that year. Thick, heavy flakes that didn't fall, they dropped, like the sky was tired. Buffalo, already a hard city, grew quieter under the weight. The streets muffled with white, the alleys darker. It was the kind of winter that cracked bones and buried secrets. Stefano Magaddino walked through it like it was nothing. Just another element to move through, like smoke or grief. The cold didn't bother him, not anymore. Not after what he'd already endured in Sicily, not after what he'd done to build his name here. But winter wasn't just in the air now, it was in the business. Something had shifted. For 2 years, Stefano had moved like a shadow, building, organizing, cutting down threats before they grew teeth. His name was respected. Whispers of the Undertaker were no longer just whispered in Italian circles. Even the Irish crews knew not to touch his streets without permission, but power always rusts from within first. It started with a man named Rocco Zambardi, a mid-level captain, Sicilian, thick hands, cold eyes. Stefano had brought him in to run the docks, collect dues from the longshoremen, and keep peace among the truck unions. At first, Rocco did the job well, quiet, efficient, but efficiency becomes ambition if you let it breathe too long. Reports came in that Rocco was skimming. Small at first, a few dollars off the top, then more. Then came whispers that he was holding meetings behind closed doors, bringing in outsiders, unknown men from Chicago and Detroit. Stefano didn't react. He never did at first. Instead, he invited Rocco to the funeral home. They sat in the back room, behind drawn velvet curtains. A single lamp glowed above a polished mahogany table. Stefano poured wine, not from a bottle, but from a decanter, blood red still. "How are the docks?" Stefano asked, calm. Rocco smiled, thin and rehearsed. "Busy, cold, but the men are working. No complaints. Stefano didn't blink. He stirred his glass, letting silence hang. You've been with me 2 winters now, he said. I remember when you had nothing. Your boots had holes. Rocco nodded slowly. And you gave me everything, Don Stefano. I never forget. Good, Stefano said, looking into his glass. Because memory is what keeps men loyal. The rest of the conversation was surface level. Weather, shipments, union chatter. But by the end of it, Rocco's hands were sweating. He left with a forced smile. But his eyes darted. He knew. Somewhere in his gut, he felt it. Stefano knew everything. 3 nights later, Rocco disappeared. No sirens, no blood in the snow, just gone. His wife filed a report. The police shrugged. No body, no crime. A week later, a new man took over the docks, Angelo Toto Caruso, a quiet nephew of one of Stefano's oldest friends. Reliable, loyal. The kind of man who kept 2 ledgers, one for numbers, one for names. That was how Stefano worked, not with noise, with precision. But Rocco's disappearance set off a ripple. Because Rocco had friends. He had ties to Detroit, to men who were watching Stefano grow too fast, too silent. He had been their eye inside Buffalo. And now, he was gone. And Stefano's name. It was getting too loud in the wrong cities. It was a man named Frank Ciccio Lapiana who came knocking next. Not literally. He wasn't foolish enough for that. But he sent a man. A message. Ciccio ran parts of Detroit. He was one of the old generation. Bootlegger days, prohibition scars on his knuckles, still wearing suspenders like it was 1920. But his mind was sharp. He saw Stefano as a threat, not because of what he did, but because of what he could do. The message was short. You've got your town, Stefano. Let us keep ours. Stefano folded the letter, lit it with a match, and let it burn in the sink of his office at the funeral home. No reply, no counter-threat. But he sent a flower to Ciccio's favorite restaurant in Detroit. 1 black rose, no note. Ciccio got the message. He wasn't scared, but he was aware now. Tensions grew. Stefano didn't like noise, but now the streets were starting to buzz, not just with fear, but curiosity. The other families, Rochester, Cleveland, even Toronto, started sending feelers, men in suits, men with clipped accents and new shoes. They wanted to understand who this Undertaker really was. Stefano met with none of them. Instead, he sent Salvatore Motisi, his consigliere, older than God, bald, with eyes that never blinked, to handle talks. Salvatore spoke softly, smiled easily, but made it clear. Stefano wasn't expanding, but he would not be told what to do in his city. Some respected that. Others saw it as arrogance, and in this life, arrogance invites bullets. The first attempt wasn't clean. It happened on a Thursday night just after closing. Stefano was locking the back door of the funeral home when a car rolled by. Too slow, too quiet. A .38 poked out the window. 1 shot cracked through the still night. The bullet missed. Not because the shooter was bad, because Stefano moved, not like a man panicking, but like someone who expected it. He ducked, pulled his own piece, a slim Colt he kept tucked behind his belt, and fired once. The car peeled off. No plate, no trail. But Stefano didn't chase. He stood there, breathing through the cold, the gun warm in his hand. And then he did something strange. He laughed, not loud, not mad, just a small, knowing laugh, like a man who just saw the end of a story he hadn't written yet. The next morning, he called a meeting. It wasn't like in the movies, no big round tables. No shouting, just 7 men, all Sicilian, all hand-picked. They met in the back room of a butcher shop, meat hooks above their heads, the air thick with iron and garlic, no phones, no windows. Stefano stood at the head of the room, hands behind his back. We've been patient, he said. We've kept our heads down. We've buried our enemies quiet. But now they send cars, bullets. He let the words hang. Let them breathe. Buffalo is ours, and it stays ours. If Detroit wants a war, he paused, looked each man in the eye. Then we give them a funeral they won't forget. The room didn't erupt. There was no cheer, just nods. Quiet ones, men who knew what came next. The next few months were a chessboard made of concrete and blood. Stefano didn't start an all-out war. That wasn't his way. He sent messages. A truck full of the bootleg cigarettes headed for Detroit got hijacked. Its contents burned in a warehouse, a black lily painted on the wall in soot. A bookmaker who'd been feeding numbers to Cicio's men was found tied to a chair in an abandoned church, mouth sewn shut, eyes missing. None of it was traced back. But everyone knew. The Undertaker was sending invitations. And then he waited. Because Stefano knew something they didn't. Men like Ciccio couldn't afford fear, but they couldn't afford loss either. Eventually, Ciccio cracked. He sent an emissary, Donato Mazzarelli, a middleman known for his silver tongue and glass jaw, to broker peace. They met at a vineyard outside Rochester. Neutral ground. Stefano arrived with 2 men. No guns, just silence. Donato smiled too much. "You've made your point," he said. "Ciccio doesn't want blood. Neither do you." Stefano didn't smile back. "Tell Ciccio this. I am the end of roads. I don't chase. But if they cross into Buffalo again, I won't send flowers next time." Donato swallowed, nodded. And just like that, the storm passed. By the end of that year, Stefano had something rarer than power. He had respect. Not just from his own, but from the whole damn Northeast. He didn't just run a city now. He defined it. And yet, he never changed. He still walked the snow-covered streets alone sometimes, hat low, coat buttoned. He still lit candles at the old church near Niagara. Still visited the graves of the forgotten men, even the ones he put there. Because Stefano Magaddino didn't see himself as a gangster. He saw himself as a caretaker, not of men, but of the old world. The Sicilian code. Honor, silence, structure. He buried betrayal, buried weakness, buried anyone who forgot who built Buffalo's bones. But he never stopped watching. Never stopped waiting. Because he knew, in this life, death is patient. And so was he. Buffalo slept in layers. There was the surface, cold streets, working men, steam rising from manholes like ghost breath. Then there was the middle, the grocers, the gamblers, the drinkers, the whispers in the barbershops. And below that, far beneath the concrete, was the quiet kingdom of Stefano Magaddino. He ruled without speeches, without parades, just silence and a hand that never trembled. By now, in the late 1940s, Stefano didn't need to introduce himself. His funeral parlors dotted the region like chess pieces. His name wasn't just a warning, it was law. He had built it all with patience and blood. But the thing about empires is they don't always fall from war. They crack from the inside. From faces that smile too long, from voices that say yes too quickly, from family. It started with Peter, Stefano's own son. Peter Magaddino had grown up in his father's shadow, watched the black cars come and go, saw men lower their voices when Stefano entered a room. He'd been raised with respect, but not warmth. Stefano wasn't the kind of father who played catch. He was the kind who taught you how to read a man's fear by the way he stirred his coffee. By the time Peter was in his 20s, he wore the Magaddino name like armor, but also like a leash. He had a sharp mind, a soft jaw, and ambition that curled beneath his skin like a fever. He wanted more. Not just power, but freedom. He didn't want to carry coffins. He wanted to drive Cadillacs down the middle of Elmwood Avenue with the top down and 2 girls in the back. Stefano didn't like it. "You move too fast," he told his son one night over dinner. "You act like there's a fire behind you. Real men. We move like fog, not flames." Peter smiled, but his eyes were already somewhere else. Then there was Nino, Stefano's nephew, born in Sicily but raised in the States. Nino was loyal, a war vet, hands like bricks, mouth like a locked door. He handled collections, kept the East Side crews in line, and had earned Stefano's trust the old-fashioned way, with bruises and blood. But he was close to Peter. Too close. And Stefano knew it. He started watching them, not out of paranoia, but out of instinct, because men like Stefano didn't believe in coincidence. And he was right to watch. The trouble began with a new crew from New Jersey, young, loud, American-born. Flashy suits, loud ties, fast mouths. They've been trying to muscle into Ontario bootlegging routes, smuggling across the border from Buffalo into Canada. Peter met with them behind Stefano's back, once, then twice. Nino set up the meetings. Peter handled the talk. The deal was simple. Allow the Jersey boys access to Buffalo's border routes in exchange for a cut of their Canadian cash, mostly narcotics and gambling. It was good money, but it was dirty money. Stefano had long avoided heroin and hard narcotics, not because he was clean, but because he knew the heat it brought. Cops, beds, rats, death. Peter didn't care. It's the future, he told Nino. Old men like my father, they don't see it coming. They think this ends in butcher shops and funeral homes, but the real power now is in white powder. Everybody wants it, and if we don't take it, someone else will. Nino nodded, slow, but even he looked nervous. Because betraying a Don is one thing, betraying your own blood is another. The first sign came from Vinny Pagliaro, a runner who worked the Ontario line. He showed up at Stefano's office with a bruised lip and a shaky voice. They're moving new product, Don Stefano, not yours. It comes through fast in cartons, no names. But Peter's name, it comes up a lot. Stefano didn't speak for a full minute. Then he stood, lit a cigarette, walked to the window where the snow had started to fall again, not in flakes, but in thin, whispery lines. You saw this yourself? He asked quietly. Vinny nodded. You didn't tell him you told me? No, sir. Stefano turned. Good. That was the last time anyone saw Vinny Pagliaro, not because Stefano was cruel, but because Stefano knew something that young men didn't. A secret told once is a secret already broken. Peter noticed. He came home late one night to find the house dark, except for the kitchen, where Stefano sat alone. No food, just coffee, black and bitter. Sit, he said without looking up. Peter did. For a moment, it was just silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that wraps around the neck. I built this with my hands, Stefano finally said. While you were still sucking your fingers, I was burying men who tried to take what's mine. Peter exhaled. I'm not taking anything, Papa. Stefano looked at him, slow, deep through the skin. You think you know better. Think the old ways are dust. That's fine. Youth thinks loud. But don't you ever mistake my silence for blindness. Peter didn't answer. You want to move with the New Jersey crew? Stefano continued. I already know. And I know what they carry. Heroin, poison. It's death in paper bags. It's profit, Peter said. And they're moving with or without us. If we don't, Stefano stood so fast the chair barely made a sound. This is not about profit. This is about control, respect, discipline. Peter stood too, eyes wide now, voice louder. Maybe you're too old to see it. Maybe the world's already changed and you just want to keep pretending it hasn't. The room went dead silent. Stefano walked up to his son, slowly, calmly. Then he reached out and tapped 2 fingers against Peter's chest. The only thing that changes in this world, boy, is how fast we die. You think they'll respect you when you bring the feds down on all our heads? You think they'll follow you when the funerals start stacking up like cards? Peter said nothing. Stefano turned away. Get out. The family cracked after that. Not loud, not fast. But the loyalty that had once held tight like rope now started to unravel thread by thread. Peter didn't leave. He stayed, on the surface. Still kissed Stefano's ring in public, still played the dutiful son. But he built his own circle now. Younger men, slick suits, whispered meetings, and Nino followed. Not because he wanted to betray his uncle, but because he feared what Peter might do if left alone. He thought he could keep it controlled, thought he could manage both sides. But Stefano saw it. He saw it all. Late one night, in the back of the funeral home, Stefano met with Salvatore Motisi, his oldest advisor. The man who had helped him bury enemies, silence traitors, build a kingdom from whispers. They're both gone, Salvatore said. In their heads, at least. Peter wants the crown. Nino thinks he's guarding it. Stefano sat with his hands folded. Blood used to mean something, he said quietly. It still does, Salvatore replied. It just spills easier now, Stefano exhaled. Watch them, but don't move. Not yet. Why wait? Stefano looked up. Because I want to see how far they'll fall without me pushing. And fall they did. The New Jersey connection turned messy. One of the trucks was stopped in Rochester. Inside, 15 kilos of heroin, pure, wrapped in brown wax paper, no names. But the driver? He had Peter's number in his pocket. The feds didn't move. Not yet. But the signal was clear. Eyes were on Buffalo now. Peter panicked. Nino tried to cover it. And Stefano just waited. Because a king who waits in silence is sometimes more terrifying than a king who attacks. But Stefano knew something else, something darker. If blood can betray, it can also be broken. And sometimes, the only way to save a kingdom is to bury your own son. The silence in the house grew thicker. It didn't speak in arguments or slamming doors. It breathed in between glances, in the way Stefano passed Peter in the hallway without a word, or how Peter lowered his eyes now like a boy who knew he had already crossed the line. Too far to return. There was no trust left, only timers ticking down between them. For months, Stefano watched from the shadow of his own empire. He let Peter spin his wheels, build his circle, run his mouth. He let Nino follow along like a dog unsure whether to guard or bite. And still, Stefano said nothing. Because some punishments aren't rushed. Some betrayals need to bloom to their ugliest form before they are pruned at the root. The heat was rising. Federal agents had begun lingering around Buffalo's east side. Not obvious, not yet, but the feeling was there. Cars parked too long. Men in plain clothes pretending not to take notes, taps on phones, anonymous questions to shopkeepers. Stefano could feel it in the air. He had known this scent before, back in the old bootlegging days when the wrong shipment at the wrong time could collapse a whole crew. But this wasn't alcohol. This was heroin, and heroin brought attention. It didn't just ruin users, it drew fire from the top. Judges, congressmen, senators trying to make examples out of men with last names that ended in vowels. Peter's name was starting to appear in too many whispers. And worse, so was Stefano's. That broke the rule. Stefano had built everything on one sacred truth. The Don never dirties his hands in what can be traced. Others moved the goods. Others played the games. Stefano? He gave orders in quiet rooms and buried disobedience beneath polished wood and silk-lined coffins. But now, thanks to Peter, the name Magaddino was starting to make its way into government files. Red ink underlines, arrows, photocopies, surveillance photos. And Stefano knew if his name burned, the whole family burned with it. He met with Salvatore Motisi again, this time not in the funeral home, but at a hunting cabin deep in the woods outside Batavia. Quiet, cold, safe. The trees groaned in the wind. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. "He's your son," Salvatore said, voice low. Stefano said nothing. He stared into the flames, unmoving. "There's still time. We cut the Jersey deal. Send Peter away for a while. Let him cool. You don't need to..." Stefano raised a hand. Slow, calm, but final. "He's not my son anymore." Salvatore's breath hitched, but he nodded, because deep down, he knew Stefano had already made his decision. "Do you want it clean?" he asked. Stefano shook his head. "I want it to mean something." A week later, the first piece moved on the board. Tommy Knife Hand Rizzo, one of Peter's most trusted muscle, was found hanging in a garage on Bailey Avenue, arms tied behind his back, mouth stuffed with playing cards. No blood, no prints, just a sign taped to his chest. "You played dirty, you get dealt." Peter lost his mind, screamed in private, smashed a mirror in his apartment, called every name he could think of. But deep down, he knew he had crossed his father, and there was no coming back. Nino tried to broker peace. He met with Stefano quietly at the edge of a cemetery near Lockport, just the two of them standing between tombstones with snow piling on their shoulders. "Zio, Uncle, he didn't mean to go behind you, he's just trying to prove himself." Stefano looked at Nino, eyes hollow, voice like a whisper through stone. "You don't prove yourself by selling poison to children and bringing heat on your family." Nino swallowed hard. He's scared. Good. Stefano turned. He should be. Peter didn't wait for another warning. He packed a bag, grabbed 2 of his last loyal men, and drove toward New Jersey, thinking maybe if he could regroup, come back with stronger backing, he could force Stefano's hand. But Stefano had already played his last card, and it was waiting for Peter just outside Syracuse. A simple roadblock, 2 cars, no lights. The snow was falling again, thick now, wet and fast. Peter slowed. Rolled down the window. A man approached, not a cop, not a friend. Nino. Peter froze. "It's you," he whispered. "You set this up?" Nino looked pained. "I begged him not to." Peter's hand moved for his glove box. Nino didn't give him the chance. 2 shots, tight and clean, 1 in the chest, 1 in the head. The glass shattered inward. Peter slumped sideways. The snow turned red. Back in Buffalo, Stefano sat alone in his study. The fire was out. Only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock broke the silence. Salvatore entered. Quiet, no words, just a nod. It was done. Stefano didn't speak. He just looked out the window. Snow falling over the city he had built. His son now part of the cold earth beneath it. The official story was carjacking gone wrong. No witnesses, no suspects. Funeral held quietly, closed casket. Only a few knew the truth, and they never spoke of it again. For weeks, Stefano didn't leave the house. He didn't take meetings, didn't visit the funeral home, didn't light his usual candle at the church. He stayed inside where the walls remembered every footstep of Peter's youth, and where now only ghosts walked. One evening, Salvatore tried to speak. "Zio, I've known you 60 years. You've buried enemies, friends, traitors." Stefano didn't look up. "But this one," Salvatore continued, "this one will follow you to your grave." Stefano lit a match, touched it to a cigarette. Then, finally, he spoke. "That's the cost of building something that lasts. The cement of an empire isn't loyalty." He took a drag, slow. "It's sacrifice." And just like that, the streets grew silent again. The feds lost interest. The Jersey crew backed off. No more noise, no more ambition, just Stefano. Alone at the top of the mountain, a king, yes, but also a father who buried his own blood to protect the crown. Time didn't slow down after Peter's death. It didn't pause for grief or bow its head out of respect. It just kept moving, relentless and cold like the Niagara River in winter. But Stefano Magaddino did slow, not in weakness, not in fear. He simply moved less, spoke less. He had removed the cancer, but at the cost of cutting into his own chest. The empire lived, but something in him didn't. The year after Peter's burial passed in a kind of hush. Buffalo was quiet again, the streets back under tight control. The docks ran smooth, the bookies paid their cuts without complaints. The whispers that had grown loud now faded back into respectful silence. People still feared him, maybe more than ever. But Stefano knew fear was a double-edged blade. It kept men in line, but it also bred resentment. And resentment. That was a seed. You couldn't always see it growing until it cracked the concrete. He had buried his son for peace, but even peace, in this world, had a half-life. In the spring of 1951, the first fissure showed. A shipment from Toronto was delayed. One of Stefano's men, Arturo Little Boots Mancuso, had gone off-grid for 3 days. When he returned, the story didn't make sense. His car was banged up, his coat smelled like fire, and worse, the shipment was light. Stefano sat across from him in the funeral parlor's side office. No threats, no shouting, just that long, slow stare he had perfected over decades. A stare that made grown men confess sins they hadn't even committed yet. "You got robbed?" Stefano asked. Arturo nodded, shifting in his seat. "Couple of kids, Don. Came out of nowhere. Had masks, guns. I gave up the load to stay alive." Stefano tapped his cigarette on the desk. 3 days, Arturo. They took the product, not you. Why?" Arturo swallowed hard. "I got lost. You got lost? In a city you've run for 10 years? Arturo's eyes darted. "I didn't know what to do." Stefano leaned forward. "You do now." The next morning, Arturo's body was found in a ravine, hands tied, eyes missing. It was a message. Not to Arturo. He was beyond messages, but to everyone else. We may be slower now, but the rules haven't changed. That message worked, for a while. But age doesn't just soften the skin, it weakens the walls. And as Stefano stepped deeper into his 60s, the cracks started to grow. Not in his power, in his control. The men under him had grown bold over the years, not loud, but bolder. The younger lieutenants no longer feared like the old guard did. They hadn't seen the worst days. They hadn't watched Stefano good a man with his own hands in Sicily, or burn a rival's house with the wife still inside. They respected him, but they didn't believe in him like before. And belief, that was the real currency. They thought, he's getting old. He buried his own blood. How much fire could be left in a man like that? They made small mistakes first, skimming, late payments, quiet deals with Cleveland and Montreal crews. Nothing Stefano couldn't fix, nothing worth a war. But he saw it. He always saw it. The real test came from within, again, not from blood this time, but from a man he had raised like a son. Paul, Fat Paulie Guzzetta. Paulie had started as a messenger, ran numbers for Nino, mopped floors at the funeral home when he was 12. He wasn't smart, not really, but he was loyal. Or so Stefano had thought. By 1952, Paulie had grown fat off the empire. He wore custom suits, drank top-shelf bourbon, laughed too loud in rooms where silence used to rule. He had ambition, and worse, he had friends in places Stefano didn't trust. Paulie started pushing back against collections, claimed certain shops couldn't pay, that some neighborhoods were drying up. But Stefano knew better. Buffalo didn't dry up, not unless someone else was squeezing the pipe from the other end. And Stefano had a guess who. He called Paulie in one morning. The room was cold, not from the weather, from the weight. Stefano sat in his usual chair. Paulie stood like a schoolboy caught smoking behind the church. "You eating good, Paulie?" Stefano asked, voice low. Paulie grinned. "Always, Don. You know me." "I do," Stefano said. "That's what worries me." The smile faltered. "I hear you're talking to Cleveland." Paulie shook his head. "Never. They reached out, but I... Don't lie." The words cut deep. No emotion, just fact. "I'm not blind, Paulie. Just quiet. You think age dulls the mind? It doesn't. It just makes us more patient." Paulie shifted. "Don Stefano, I've done nothing but wait," Stefano interrupted. "Wait for me to die. Wait for a crack. But I don't crack. I bury." Paulie's lips tightened. His hands twitched, like maybe he thought he could go for a gun. Stefano just smiled. "If you raise that hand, Paulie, you better kill me. Because if you miss, I will dig a grave so deep no one will ever find what's left of you." Paulie dropped his hands, left without another word. The next week, Paulie disappeared. But not the usual kind of disappearance. He didn't end up in a river. His car didn't explode. No, Stefano let him go, sent a message through Nino. "He's banished. No protection, no support. He's dead to us, but not worth the bullet." To the other men, it was confusing. Why spare him? Why not make an example? But Stefano knew better. "Let him live," he told Salvatore. "Let him grow fat, paranoid, and hunted. Let him see what the world looks like without my shadow over him. That's a better punishment than death." And it was. Paulie ran. Fast. Ended up in Chicago, then in Vegas. He was dead within the year, not by Stefano's hand, but by another Don who didn't believe in mercy. Sometimes, Stefano thought, the best revenge is letting a fool dig his own grave. But all these moves, all these cleanups, they drained him. The walls were still standing, but he had to work harder to keep them up. More meetings, more listening, and always more watching. The streets respected him, but they were waiting for him to slip, to slow just one step too much, to close his eyes too long. One night, Stefano sat alone in his parlor. The curtains were drawn. Rain tapped at the glass like tiny knuckles. He poured a glass of Chianti, looked over the city from the top floor. The streets glittered below, quiet, safe, his. But in his chest he felt it, that cold truth he never said aloud. time is loyal to no man. He had ruled longer than most, killed smarter than most, outlasted rivals from every coast. But there were new names now. Names that didn't care about Sicilian codes or blood oaths. Names that saw profit, not principle. And they were coming. It was 1954, and Stefano Magaddino could feel the shift under his feet, not in explosions or shootouts. No. Stefano's empire had survived all that. What was coming now was more dangerous than gunfire. It was change, the kind that creeps slow, draped in suits and smiles, asking questions instead of making threats. The new wave of gangsters had arrived, and they didn't speak with Sicilian tongues anymore. They were American-born, young, clean-cut, Catholic in public, cruel in private. They didn't care for the old ways, didn't light candles for dead friends, didn't understand what it meant to kiss a ring or carry the weight of the Omerta code in your chest like iron. To them, Don Magaddino was a figurehead, a myth, a man sitting in his funeral home handing out whispers like they still mattered. But Stefano saw them clearly. He saw the shoes that cost more than their fathers made in a month, the Cadillacs they didn't earn, and the cockiness in their voices when they referred to business like it was a side hustle. They weren't made men. They were made by magazines. And slowly, they were leaking into Buffalo. It began with Vince Scaletta, a kid from Brooklyn, sent upstate by the Genovese family to help expand the labor connections. On paper, he was polite, sharp, smiling, said all the right things to Stefano's face, called him Don with syrup in his tone. But behind closed doors, Vince was already offering better cuts to Stefano's capos, flashing envelopes, promising fast money with no blood, no rules. Men started missing meetings, showing up late, making excuses. The structure Stefano had spent decades building was bending. He didn't react at first. He watched. That was always his way. Then came the government pressure. This time, not just local cops sniffing around. This time, it was federal. Senator Estes Kefauver had already dragged half of New York's families into national hearings. Chicago had been embarrassed on television. Jersey had turned on itself. Names were dropping, and the feds were hungry for more. And then Buffalo hit the radar. Stefano's name was printed in a Senate report, not as an accused man, but as a figure of interest in Western New York's labor union infiltration. That was enough. The FBI opened File 92 Hotel Nordar 208. Stefano Magaddino, suspected organized crime leader. They didn't knock on his door. They parked down the street. They watched his funeral home. They took photos of who came in and out. And Stefano? He watched them back. One afternoon, he sat across from Nino, who had aged too. Thicker in the gut, slower with his hands, but loyal. They don't come for men like me with bullets anymore, Stefano said, sipping espresso. They come with paper, suits, and tape recorders. Nino grunted, so we cut their tongues out. Stefano smiled faintly. You can't cut paper, Nino. It burns. And when it burns, it spreads. He paused, then added, but we can still bury it. To counter the feds, Stefano tightened the screws on internal security. No phones for business, no written records. All money counted by hand, behind locked doors in windowless rooms. He reinstated old rules. No one sat at a table armed, no one brought outsiders near operations, and no one, not even the oldest lieutenants, acted without speaking to him first. Some of the younger men bristled. Stefano noticed. He always noticed. It was Frankie Russo who tested him next. 29 years old, born in Buffalo but raised in Las Vegas. Thought the game was about numbers and smiles. Started skimming off union dues, not for survival, but for nightclubs, suits, and women with fake blonde hair. Stefano let it go for 2 months. Then he had Nino bring him in. They met in the basement of the original funeral parlor. Low ceiling, damp brick walls. The room where Stefano used to store bodies in ice during the early days. Frankie came in grinning, wearing cologne so thick it entered the room before he did. Don Magaddino, he said, all charm. You wanted to see me? Stefano nodded. I hear you've been busy, Frankie shrugged. Always working. Making friends in Vegas again? Frankie's grin faltered just slightly. Just visiting some old faces. Stefano stood slowly. walked to a small cabinet, opened it, pulled out a box. Inside, a ledger, one Frankie thought he'd destroyed. He set it on the table. "You know what I hate more than thieves?" Stefano asked, voice soft. Frankie didn't answer. "Liars." He nodded once. Nino moved. Two men grabbed Frankie. Quick, no ceremony. Stefano didn't watch what happened next. He walked back upstairs, the faint sound of flesh hitting brick behind him. Frankie was never seen again. Another story for the shadows, another reminder. But violence was a language the young didn't understand anymore. They understood headlines, deals, fame. They were watching TV now, not the door. In 1955, a new kind of insult arrived, this one from inside the commission. New York's 5 families had met and redrawn regional influence charts, informal but respected maps of who controlled what. Buffalo? It was shrinking on the paper. Stefano saw the map during a meeting with Bonanno in New York, his old cousin. Still friendly, but now playing a different game, more political, more cautious. "They think you're fading," Joseph said quietly. "You don't travel anymore. You don't meet the others." "I meet who I need," Stefano replied, sipping wine. "I don't dance for men I fed as children." But the insult stayed in his gut like spoiled meat. They were circling. The vultures didn't wait for death anymore. They tapped their watches and asked for a timeline. But Stefano wasn't done. Not yet. He still had loyal men, still had the funeral homes, still had leverage in the unions. What he didn't have, not fully, was fear. And without fear, respect starts to slip. He made one final move that year to show the underworld that the Undertaker was still breathing fire. A Detroit crew had started offering protection to Canadian smugglers trying to bypass Buffalo. Quiet, sneaky, cheap. Stefano sent Salvatore Motisi, old now, nearly blind in one eye, but still sharp as a razor, to deliver a message. The meeting was short. Salvatore handed the Detroit man a white envelope. Inside, a black tie and a death certificate with no name. The message was clear. "You're already dead. You just don't know the date yet." 3 days later, a warehouse in Windsor burned to the ground. Inside were 4 bodies, unidentifiable. Stefano didn't smile when he heard. He just nodded. The young men got the message, but so did the FBI. That fall, agents raided one of Stefano's trucks at the border. No drugs, but plenty of documents. The charges didn't stick, too thin. But it didn't matter. Now, his name was officially active in Washington files. Magaddino was no longer a ghost. He was a target. And in his home at night, Stefano felt the shift in his bones. The empire wasn't crumbling, but the cracks were showing. He still ruled. But now, he ruled in the twilight. The old men weren't many anymore. They used to sit around long tables, all of them with black hair, black suits, and black eyes, talking softly about death like it was just another line item on the balance sheet. They'd share espresso, curse in Sicilian, and remind each other of the days when respect came before ambition. Now, those tables were mostly empty. Some had died in prison, some had disappeared into desert holes or Atlantic shallows, and some had grown quiet. Retreating into the corners of their homes like furniture, no one moved anymore. Stefano Magaddino was among the last, still standing, but standing alone. It was 1956, and the world around him was louder now. Radio static poured out of diners. Teenagers danced to music that didn't sound like music. Boys with clean jaws and no war in their blood walked like they owned the streets. Even the streets themselves had changed. New cement, wider lanes, electric lights humming over corners that used to go dark after sundown, when business was done in whispers. Buffalo was growing fast, but it was leaving him behind, and Stefano could feel it in his bones. Not pain, not age, just disconnect. Like he was watching a movie that didn't pause for him anymore. The loyalty was still there, on the surface. Men still kissed his ring. They still brought him envelopes on Fridays, still called him Don Stefano like they meant it. But underneath, he could sense the shift. They respected his legend, not his decisions. They honored his name, but only because it was carved deep into the bones of the city. They obeyed, but not from belief, from habit. And Stefano knew all too well, loyalty built on habit is the weakest threat of all. Then came the Niagara Falls meeting, one of the last real sit-downs where old power met new. It was held at a quiet estate in Lewiston, under the guise of a retirement party. Men came in suits, drove in pairs, and left their weapons in their glove boxes, all pretending things were still the way they used to be. But it wasn't a meeting. It was a test. They wanted to see if Stefano could still lead. He sat at the head of the table, silent while names were thrown around. New names: Jersey crews, Vegas upstarts, Canadians with loose tongues and fat wallets. Someone suggested merging territories across the border. Cut the route with Montreal, 50-50. Split the dock fees, rotate the collections. Stefano raised a hand. No words yet, just the weight of his gesture. Then he spoke. You want to share what we bled for? A few younger men shifted in their chairs. You forget who cleaned these streets, he continued. You forget who kept Buffalo safe while you all played tag with the FBI. The room was quiet, but not in fear, in boredom. One man, some Jersey capo barely old enough to shave, whispered, "Safe from what?" That sentence hung in the air like a mistake you couldn't take back. After the meeting, Stefano sat outside by himself. The river below shimmered in the dark, whispering like it always had. Salvatore Motisi joined him, old, hunched, his breath shallow. Even he looked tired of holding up the sky. They don't believe anymore, Salvatore said softly. Stefano didn't answer. They smile in your face, but their hearts are already shopping for another king. Still no reply. You're not weak, Salvatore added, but you're no longer what they want. Stefano finally lit a cigarette, took a slow drag. Then they'll learn what it costs to want the wrong thing. But Stefano didn't act rashly. He never had. Instead, he tested his circle, small, subtle moves. He gave Antonio Greco, one of his rising captains, a simple order. Collect a shipment from Erie, deliver it across the border by nightfall. 3 days later, the shipment was late. And when it arrived, it was short. No explanation, just apologies, stammered excuses. Antonio's tone wasn't fear, it was dismissal. Like Stefano was just another old man asking too many questions. So Stefano waited. A week later, Antonio's mistress was found dead, not from a bullet, from a heroin overdose. No one could trace it back. No one had to. The message was clear. You don't steal from a man who built the graveyard, but fear alone wouldn't fix what was cracking. The real threat came from the government now, and not just in black cars and FBI files. They were changing the narrative. Senators called him a domestic threat. Newspapers printed his name under headlines about drugs and racketeering, even when he wasn't involved. They didn't need proof anymore. They just needed words. Stefano Magaddino, once a ghost in the alleys, was now a face on bulletin boards. And nothing ruins a king faster than attention. The final blow that year didn't come from the streets. It came from inside his own family, again. This time, from his grandson, Charles. Just 21, raised in America, college-educated, slick, handsome, thought the whole Mafia thing was outdated nonsense. He got picked up in a nightclub with a stolen car, 2 prostitutes, and half a kilo of amphetamines in the trunk. Worse? He used the Magaddino name when the cops tried to book him. I'm with Don Stefano. You don't want this heat. It was in the police report, printed in the Buffalo Courier the next morning. Stefano's bloodline, again, dragging his name through the mud. He didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just called for Charles the next morning, made him sit at the kitchen table. No lieutenants, no soldiers, just an old man, and the boy who thought he was untouchable. You carry my name like a weapon, Stefano said, but you don't understand what it cost to build. Charles looked nervous, but not enough. It was a mistake, Nono. A mistake is breaking a glass. What you did is spit on our graves. Charles's voice rose. It's not like it means anything anymore. You act like we're royalty, but we're just thugs in nice suits now. Stefano stood, slowly, deliberately. He walked behind Charles and placed a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't tender. Then go, he said. Charles turned, confused. What? Leave. Now. You're no longer part of this house. You'll get no money, no protection. If I see your face again, I'll bury you next to Peter. Silence. Charles stood, mouth open like he might say something. Then he saw the look in Stefano's eyes, and he walked out without another word. That night, Stefano sat alone in his study. The candles flickered against the walls. The silence pressed harder than usual. Not grief, not regret, just a slow, brutal realization. You can't inherit belief. You can't force tradition into blood that's gone cold. The following week, he visited the graveyard. Not with flowers, not even with prayer. Just stood there, coat tight, wind howling. Peter's grave, his wife's. Now, an empty plot next to them, the one he had reserved for himself. He stared at it, long, as if wondering whether everything he'd built had been worth the bodies underneath it. But still, he didn't surrender. Because men like Stefano Magaddino don't go quietly. They rot while standing. They burn without smoke. And they smile at the world's disrespect, because they know something the world doesn't. Even if you forget the king, you'll never forget the grave he put you in. The silence no longer brought peace. For years, Stefano Magaddino had lived by the code of stillness, watching, waiting, never rushing into anything, never letting emotion dictate power. But now, in the quiet hours of the morning, silence didn't feel like control anymore. It felt like isolation. His house was still. The heavy drapes stayed drawn. The old floorboards creaked only under his own steps now. Where once there were voices, movement, laughter from the kitchen, footsteps of loyal men and blood family, now there was only the clock ticking on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. Time, always moving, always louder when the empire starts to fade. The streets still carried his shadow. People still called him Don Stefano. The money still came in. His name still mattered. But respect had changed. It wasn't carved into bone anymore. It was written on paper, passed around in files, whispered through wires, dictated by lawyers and agents who knew nothing of the old ways. And worse, it was challenged in the very streets he once built with his silence. Buffalo's neighborhoods, once loyal, were splintering. Not because of war, not because of blood, because of options. Other names, younger names, louder names, stepping in, promising new structure, new money, new ways. Some tied to New York, some to Montreal, some even tied to Las Vegas. Places Stefano had never respected. These weren't men of Cosa Nostra. They were businessmen with guns, suits before silence, profit before principle. And they were eroding his world one deal at a time. In the old days, the streets knew fear. They remembered what it meant when the Undertaker's car pulled up in front of a store, or when one of his men knocked after midnight. But now, even fear felt old. It was Salvatore Motisi, his oldest confidant, who finally spoke the truth aloud in the basement of the original funeral home where they had buried so many secrets. Salvatore sat with trembling hands, his breathing wheezed. His face was pale and loose, his skin like wet paper, but his eyes were still alive. "Stefano," he said quietly. "It's coming undone." Stefano didn't respond. He sat in his chair, hands folded, staring at the floor like he was studying a ghost. "The young ones," Salvatore continued, "they're meeting behind your back, not just talking now, planning. They think, maybe it's time." Still, silence. Salvatore's eyes narrowed. "They're not asking permission, they're asking each other." Stefano finally looked up. His voice, when it came, was steady, deep. Let them?" Salvatore blinked. Let them plan, let them whisper. Let them build their castles out of cards, then I'll blow once and watch it all fall." Salvatore looked at him, and for the first time in years, he didn't see the untouchable Don. He saw a tired man holding on to a kingdom made of fading memory and dead men's bones. "They won't wait long, Stefano," he said, "and neither will the feds." Because while his empire crumbled from the inside, the government tightened its grip from the outside. Stefano had avoided direct charges his entire life. He was the ghost, never in the room, never with fingerprints, always 3 names removed from any crime. But now the feds weren't chasing crime, they were chasing structure. They wanted the web, who met with who sent the orders, who called the shots behind the scenes. And they knew with sick certainty that all lines eventually led back to Magaddino. They began digging, phone taps, undercover agents, deals made with minor players willing to trade decades of silence for short sentences and witness protection. One name surfaced again and again, the old man. They couldn't get him yet, not without risk, not without something solid, but they were getting closer. And Stefano could smell it in the air, the sweat of men who once feared him, now wondering if he was still worth fearing. Then came the New Rochelle meeting, not called by Stefano. He was invited, a formality really. They held it under the pretense of settling turf agreements between Buffalo and Rochester. But it was a political play, a gathering of men, mostly younger, who wanted to test the waters of his influence. Stefano arrived late, not by mistake, by design. When he entered the room, a small banquet hall rented under a fake charity organization, the talking stopped for only a moment, only long enough to be polite. He walked in slowly, black coat over his shoulders, walking stick in hand. His hat cast a deep shadow over his face. To those who didn't know, he looked frail. To those who did, he looked like the end of an era walking in the flesh. He took his seat without a word, no handshake, no smile. Across from him sat Luca Bravetti, 38, slick hair, dark suit, fast mouth. He was one of the new voices rising fast out of Rochester, connected, cunning, and dangerous in a way that didn't involve getting his hands dirty. Luca stood, held his glass. "It's good to have the Don with us," he said. "Your presence brings weight, even if the world is getting lighter." A few laughed. Stefano didn't move. "We're here," Luca continued, "to discuss a future that doesn't run on traditions alone, a future that adjusts, evolves." He smiled directly at Stefano now. No disrespect, Don Stefano, but the world doesn't wait for kings to die anymore. Sometimes it appoints new ones. That was the line. That was the play. Stefano stood slowly. No anger, no fire. He simply looked around the room. "You want faster cars, flashier suits, new titles. You speak of evolution. But what do you know of death? Silence. You inherit dirt and think it's yours. You call meetings and think that makes you leaders. But when the war comes, when the cops break your doors down, when the men you love are found face down in ditches," he stepped closer to Luca, "then you'll remember my name." And with that, he walked out. No vote was taken, no decision made, but the message delivered. The meeting never resumed. But messages don't always matter anymore. The next week, one of his oldest fronts, a funeral home on Niagara Street, was raided. No drugs, no weapons. But they took files, photographs, rolled up ledgers and pocketed them like gold. They were looking for proof. And this time, they had time on their side. In the weeks that followed, more signs came. Whispers of capos taking meetings without permission, a Canadian connection trying to cut Buffalo out of the smuggling route entirely. And worst of all, one of Stefano's trusted lieutenants, Eugenio Gene Ferraro, disappeared. At first, it was thought to be a kidnapping, but days passed, no ransom, no calls. Then a letter arrived, typed, no return address. He chose a future with better odds. You can't bury everyone, Don. Stefano read the letter 3 times. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lit it over a candle. The fire crawled up the page. No expression crossed his face. He whispered something in Sicilian, soft like a prayer or a curse. Then he walked to the chapel and lit a candle. Not for Jean, but for what he knew was coming. Because for the first time in decades, he could feel death walking in his direction, not the kind you send, the kind that comes for you. The wind off Lake Erie was cold that winter, colder than it had been in years. It didn't just chill the skin. It reached into the bones, into the cracks of buildings, the corners of graves, and the lungs of old men who had outlived too much. Stefano Magaddino didn't fear cold. He'd lived through Sicilian winters with nothing but boots and bone. He had survived gunfire, betrayal, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the kind of backroom bloodshed that made books seem tame. But this winter was different. This one carried a smell in the air he'd known since childhood, the smell of finality. They came for him not with bullets, but with warrants. March 1st, 1957. 4 black government cars pulled up in front of the original Niagara Street funeral home. No sirens, just tires crunching gravel and the metallic click of doors opening one by one. Inside, Stefano sat behind his desk. Old wood, stained edges. It still smelled of tobacco and death. He didn't flinch when the door opened. The agent leading the charge was James Kowalski, a young, hungry investigator with stiff shoulders and federal pride in his veins. He had been chasing Stefano for over a year. Interviews, wiretaps, informants, and now search warrants. "Mr. Magaddino," he said, too polite, "we'd like to take a look around." Stefano didn't look up from the book he was reading. A Bible, not because he was religious, but because it was the one book that understood blood. "Take what you want," he said calmly. "The dead don't keep secrets." The agents didn't laugh. They moved through the office, touching drawers, pulling cabinets. One of them knocked over an urn. It cracked, scattering gray ash onto the rug. Stefano didn't move. Kowalski knelt, scooped up the remains with clumsy hands. "Sorry," he muttered. Stefano looked at him cold. "That was my wife." Kowalski froze. It wasn't true. The urn was filled with discarded cigarette ash and fine dirt. But the way Stefano said it made the agent step back, face pale, hands trembling. That was the old power still at work. Not muscle, not bullets. Just presence. They found nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no ledgers. Just dust, candles, and the long shadow of memory. But they didn't need anything physical. They had enough on others. And those others? They were starting to talk. Within weeks, 4 of Stefano's former lieutenants had been subpoenaed. 2 testified behind closed doors. 1 fled to Canada. 1 turned up dead in a motel room outside Cleveland. A pillow over the face. No sign of struggle. No forced entry. Suicide, they called it. But anyone who'd lived in this world long enough knew better. And now the government had names. Timelines. Rumors of extortion. Sketches of family hierarchy. Union affiliations. Offshore laundering schemes that, even if exaggerated, were enough to build pressure. And Stefano. He didn't blink. But inside, he could feel the tremors. Not of fear, but of history repeating itself. He had seen this before, in Palermo, in Castellammare, in New York during Prohibition. Every time the old ways began to burn, it started like this. Not with war, but with disloyalty, wrapped in smiles and sealed court transcripts. Salvatore Motisi came to him late one night. They met in the church basement, same bench as always. The candles had burned low. "They're pressing Nino," Salvatore said. "For what?" "They want him to flip. He's not talking, but he's scared. He's got a wife now. Kids." Stefano nodded once, slowly. "I don't blame him." Salvatore looked surprised. "You'd forgive him?" Stefano didn't answer right away. He looked at the flame of the closest candle. "Forgiveness is for men with time. I have none." Still, he didn't act. He didn't strike. Didn't silence Nino. Didn't make anyone disappear. Not because he had gone soft, but because he understood something the younger men didn't. A drowning empire doesn't need more blood. It needs clarity. If he killed now, it wouldn't send a message of strength. It would scream panic. And Stefano Magaddino had never panicked in his life. Instead, he made one final move. A meeting. Not with crews, not with his lieutenants, but with the last few men in America who still called him Don without irony. He called it in secret. No invitations, no fanfare. Just whispers carried by old men who still remembered the rules. They met in a remote farmhouse in the hills outside Batavia, surrounded by trees, silence, and decades of history. The room was dim. 10 chairs, 9 men, and Stefano at the head. He stood without support this time. No cane, no hat. His voice was low but crisp. I built something that stretched beyond blood. It wasn't about money. It was about order. They listened, still. Even now. The world doesn't fear us anymore. That's fine. But they should still respect the laws we lived by. He paused, looked each of them in the eye. You can break off, form your own cells, answer to the suits in Vegas if that's what you want, but understand, once you throw out the old laws, you invite chaos. And chaos doesn't build empires. It just burns. They didn't argue. They didn't clap. They just sat quietly, absorbing what they knew might be his last speech as dawn. And then Stefano left, alone, into the falling snow. A black coat, a slow gait, and the silence of a man who had already buried his own legacy in the dirt he once ruled. 2 weeks later, the FBI raided again. This time it wasn't just the funeral home, it was his house. They brought cameras, reporters, flashed headlines across the state. Buffalo Mafia boss faces federal racketeering charges. Undertaker of New York Empire finally cornered. They arrested 3 of his men, found envelopes with unregistered bank account numbers, photographs, letters, and a handwritten document in Stefano's own script hidden behind a false panel in his wardrobe. A code book. Old, faded, detailed, dated as far back as 1933. They had their evidence. That night, Stefano was brought in, booking photo, fingerprinting. He didn't speak. When asked for a statement, he looked at the reporter and said, "I'll be buried before I stand in a courtroom." The next day, he was released on health grounds, age, blood pressure, influence. But he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man with a target on his back and a name on every agent's desk. And even the streets, the ones he used to rule with glances, now whispered things they never would have dared before. He's finished. Too old. He can't protect anyone anymore. Might be time for a new king. Back in his home, Stefano walked the dark halls like a man passing through a museum of his own life. Every photo on the wall had eyes, eyes that used to fear him. Now, they looked curious, like they were watching to see how a king dies when no one's watching. The air in the house had changed. It no longer smelled of pipe smoke, dust, and old paper, the things Stefano Magaddino had grown used to. Now, it smelled like waiting, like something was about to happen, like the walls had already heard it before he had. It was April 1957, and the silence had become a stranger. The phone no longer rang with updates. Envelopes no longer arrived on Friday. The men who used to check in, Salvatore's nephews, the old runners, even some of the union boys, were suddenly busy, or out of town, or handling things. And in his gut, Stefano knew. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was abandonment for a man who had spent decades watching, analyzing, and controlling the very pulse of Buffalo's underworld. Stefano felt the most dangerous thing creeping now. Not an enemy, not a bullet, but a question. What happens when the men you raised stop needing you? Salvatore Motisi died quietly that week. Old age. Nothing violent. His heart simply gave out while lighting a candle in the chapel. They found him slumped against the bench where he and Stefano had talked for over 30 years. His hat was still in his lap, his lips half open, as if he had one last sentence waiting that never got spoken. The funeral was private. Only 6 men showed. 6 for the consigliere who had held Buffalo's silence in his hands. Stefano watched the burial from a distance. Dressed in black, hands behind his back, face pale under the cold sun, not a tear, not a word. But when they lowered Salvatore's body, something changed behind Stefano's eyes. Not grief. He'd buried too many for that. But a quiet, shaking realization. Now he was truly alone. He returned home, locked the doors, and didn't speak to anyone for 2 days. When Nino finally knocked, Stefano didn't answer. It took 3 more knocks before the door creaked open. Nino stepped in, cautious, respectful. He looked older now, too, not from age, but from weight, a kind of spiritual fatigue that comes from carrying secrets that might shatter everything. "I brought soup," he said, lifting the bag like a child offering tribute. Stefano said nothing. He walked back into the den and sat in his old chair. The fireplace was out. The room smelled like dust and memory. Nino sat across from him. They didn't speak for a long time. Just the clock ticking, just the creak of wood, just the sighs of two men who remembered when the world made more sense. Then Stefano finally asked, "Are they planning it?" Nino froze. "Who?" Stefano raised an eyebrow. The look said, "Don't insult me." Nino sighed. "Some are talking, quietly. They don't want to move against you. They just want options." "Options," Stefano repeated. Nino nodded. "You've outlived fear, Zio. But men like Luca Brevetti, they're not afraid of ghosts." Stefano leaned forward. "And you, Nino? Are you afraid of ghosts?" Nino looked down at his hands. "I'm afraid of what happens when the last real man leaves the room." That was all the truth Stefano needed. But truth doesn't stop decay. 2 nights later, word reached Stefano that Enzo Perrone, a man he'd personally raised from a teenage numbers runner into a captain, had held a private meeting in Toronto with 3 other mid-level bosses. They were carving up parts of Buffalo. In conversation only. But conversation in this world was the first bullet fired. Worse. Enzo was speaking as if Stefano was already dead. Stefano called for Enzo the next morning, sent Nino personally. The boy came quickly, dressed sharp, shoes polished, hair slicked like a businessman going to meet a client. But when he walked into the room, he didn't bow. He didn't even sit until asked. Stefano watched him closely. Enzo had grown into a handsome man, confident, clean, polished, the kind of man who looked like he belonged at a boardroom table, not a butcher's back room. "You called for me. Don Stefano?" he asked, smooth as butter. "I did," Stefano said. "You've been busy." Enzo didn't blink. "Trying to keep the streets clean." "Clean?" Stefano leaned back. "That's not what I heard." Enzo shrugged, casual. "Men talk. I can't control every whisper." Stefano stared. "You're planning something." Enzo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm planning for when the inevitable happens." Silence. Cold. Immediate. "You think I'm done?" Stefano asked, voice low. Enzo didn't flinch. "I think Buffalo needs fresh hands, younger men, new rules." "No rules," Stefano corrected. "Just shortcuts." Enzo leaned forward. "You're the last of them, Don Stefano, but the old ways don't work anymore. The suits in Vegas don't care about honor. The FBI doesn't care about omerta. This world, it moves fast now, and you move slow." Stefano nodded, then stood. "You think I'll let you walk out of here after saying that?" Enzo stood too. Brave, bold. "If you kill me, Don, the rest will move faster. You'll be signaling desperation. But if you let me walk, maybe we find a way to ease the transition." Stefano looked at him for a long, long moment. Then he turned away. "Go." Enzo hesitated. "Just like that?" "I don't need to kill you today," Stefano said. "You're already burying yourself. You just haven't heard the dirt hit the lid yet." Enzo left. Nino watched him go. Then looked at Stefano. "Should have killed him." "No," Stefano replied. "Let him gather his men. Let him feel safe. Then we break his teeth in front of them." But deep inside, Stefano knew. He wasn't dealing with Enzo alone. He was dealing with the death of the code. The young no longer feared silence. They wanted headlines. They wanted speed. They wanted everything the old world said was poison. And maybe they were right. Because as Stefano sat alone that night, flipping through old photographs, men long dead, standing in front of butcher shops and funeral homes, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been the last loyal man in a disloyal empire. But even dying kings have one last card. And Stefano wasn't done. He called Nino the next morning and whispered the plan. Not into a phone, not even aloud. He wrote it, in pencil on a napkin, and lit it on fire once Nino had memorized it. One more play, one more funeral, not for a man, but for everything that came after. The plan was not written down, not a single name, not a date, not a whisper. Stefano Magaddino knew better than anyone. that in the modern world, paper kills. Words get recorded. Trust gets subpoenaed. History is written by prosecutors and cowards with taped conversations. So, he didn't write it. He breathed it. To Nino, and Nino alone. A short sentence, a nod. A code they had shared since Sicily, back when messages were sewn into priest robes and passed through prayer candles. The snake's teeth are in Niagara. Pull one. Let the others watch it bleed. Nino said nothing, just a sharp nod. And the plan was in motion. The city had grown too bold. Meetings were happening without clearance. Men Stefano had fed, raised, protected, were making power plays like teenagers with switchblades in a schoolyard. He had let it simmer, to watch, to study, to wait. But now it was boiling. And Stefano was tired of the smell. The target was clear. Enzo Perrone, the polished, ambitious trader in an expensive coat and American ambitions. He had crossed the final line, not with a bullet, but with a move on the unions. Specifically, the longshoremen's Local 224, a loyal arm of Stefano's operation since Prohibition. Enzo, backed by Luca Brevetti and whispers of support from Montreal, had tried to bribe the leadership, offering higher percentages, less overhead, and no old rules. What he offered, in short, was everything Stefano wasn't, and that was the mistake. Because when you offer comfort to wolves, you forget what it cost to make them eat out of your hand in the first place. Nino went to work quickly. No mess, no meetings. He called in 2 men, not young, not eager, not known. Just quiet, like Stefano liked it. One from Erie, one from Ontario, paid in cash, no names exchanged, no promises made. They weren't told to kill Enzo. That would have been too easy, too expected. Stefano wanted a message. April 28, 1957. Enzo Perrone arrived at his tailor in downtown Buffalo just after 2 p.m. Wore his usual charcoal suit, cufflinks shaped like lion heads, shoes shined so bright they mirrored the sky. He nodded to the girl at the counter, walked to the back for his fitting. He didn't see the van pull up, didn't notice the side door of the shop quietly unlock. One man entered, no mask, just calm eyes and gloved hands. By the time Enzo looked up from the mirror, it was too late. A cord around the neck. Quick, not deadly, just enough to drop him. When he woke, he was tied to a chair in a back room, not the tailor's, somewhere else, dark, cold, silent, just 2 men, one with a knife, one with a camera, and behind them, Nino, standing in the shadows, arms crossed. No threats, no yelling, just the ritual. They didn't cut his throat, they didn't pull fingernails, they just took his tongue, fast, one slice, blood in the cloth, tape across the mouth, then the camera clicked. The photo arrived at Luca Brevetti's office the next morning, in a plain envelope. No message, just Enzo, sitting in a chair, alive, wide-eyed in pain, mouth bleeding, hands bound. A single black lily pinned to his chest. Luca's face went pale. He knew what it meant. He called off every deal in progress, froze all communications, pulled his men from the unions, canceled 2 out-of-state trips, because now it wasn't a power struggle. It was a funeral rehearsal. And everyone knew who wrote the hymn. Enzo was found 3 days later, alive, barely, dumped near the Niagara River, his tongue cauterized, wrists broken, but heart still beating. That was the point. He wasn't supposed to die. He was supposed to live long enough to teach. Buffalo fell quiet, not from fear, but from remembrance of what it had forgotten, of who it had betrayed, of the Undertaker who had not only buried bodies, but built the graveyard itself. Stefano didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He just sat in his chair, hands folded, listening to the wind whistle through the walls. Nino returned that night. No words, just poured 2 glasses of wine, set one down. They drank in silence. Finally, Nino spoke. "You stopped a war." Stefano shook his head. "I gave them a tombstone to stare at. If they want a war, it'll be their own funeral." But it wasn't just the streets watching. The FBI was watching too. And the tongueless captain became a federal scandal. Newspapers ran headlines. "Gangland torture in Buffalo. Magaddino empire strikes again. Mafia message mutilates mid-level boss. Senators spoke out. Investigations reopened. The FBI returned to the funeral homes, the butcher shops, the bars. They weren't asking questions anymore. They were preparing indictments. But Stefano didn't flinch. He'd buried too many enemies to fear a courtroom. What he feared, if anything, was being forgotten. And now, they remembered. It's a strange thing to survive your own empire. The city hadn't changed much. Buffalo still had its wind, its soot-stained windows, its crooked sidewalks. But something had shifted in the way people moved. Men didn't meet eyes on corners anymore. Shops that once paid tribute in silence now kept receipts and lawyers on speed dial. And the Undertaker who used to run it all, he was now a symbol, not a leader. Revered, but not followed. Stefano Magaddino still had the name, but names don't hold power when no one dares say them out loud anymore. The Enzo Perrone incident had frozen the streets. That photo, the black lily, the bleeding mouth, the cold stare, had done what bullets no longer could. It reminded people that the old rules still had teeth, that some thrones didn't get abdicated. They had to be pulled from the earth, brick by brick, bone by bone. But what Stefano hadn't calculated was how visible that message would become. The FBI didn't miss it. They knew it wasn't just about one man being silenced. It was about a kingdom declaring, "We're still here." And when kingdoms speak like that, governments move. The subpoenas started arriving in waves. Nino was called. 3 capos from Niagara Falls were summoned to closed-door federal grand juries. Bank accounts flagged. Old real estate purchases reopened. Taps were placed on phones that hadn't rung in years. Stefano wasn't surprised. He just lit another cigarette and told Nino, "Let them dig. All they'll find is dirt and regrets." But even he knew this wasn't like before. This wasn't a vendetta or a street war. This was institutional. This was systemic. This was a slow collapse from the outside in. Then came the worst piece of news. A man named Teddy Greco, a bookkeeper who had worked for one of Stefano's front businesses in the 40s, flipped. He'd been picked up on tax evasion, threatened with a 25-year sentence, and just like that, he started talking. Not about murders, he didn't know those, but money, names, payouts. He gave them 10 years' worth, most of it circumstantial, some of it outdated, but enough to map out Stefano's financial structure, at least what was left of it. The indictment came in June of 1957. Federal racketeering, tax fraud, conspiracy to launder funds through multiple funeral homes and religious fronts. The newspapers had a field day. Buffalo's Undertaker faces final judgment. Mafia kingpin named in federal crackdown. Photos of Stefano, aged, dark-eyed, still sharp in his black coat, plastered across headlines like a museum exhibit. To the world, it looked like the end of a legend. To Stefano, it was just the beginning of a different war. They didn't arrest him at home. They summoned him, like a politician. A knock on the door. 2 agents in suits. One held the paper, the other held nothing at all. "You've been asked to surrender, Mr. Magaddino." Stefano didn't argue, didn't blink, didn't speak. He simply put on his coat, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out the door like a man leaving church. The federal building was clean, cold, fluorescent. They didn't put him in a holding cell. He sat in an interview room. No handcuffs, no yelling, just long silences, and a young federal attorney named Marcus Kessler, who stared at him like he was trying to read a language no longer spoken. "You've been in this city your whole life," Kessler said. "You've outlived your enemies, your partners, even your blood." Stefano said nothing. "But you haven't outlived us." Still silence. "We don't need your confession, Mr. Magaddino. We just need time, and we have plenty." Stefano finally spoke. Just one sentence. "I built this place while your grandfather begged for bread." Kessler leaned forward. "And I'll tear it down while your grandson prays for a plea deal." They released him on medical bail. Age and blood pressure made him low flight risk. But now he was out in the open. A public figure, a hunted symbol, a man waiting to be nailed to the wall. And the worst part? The silence was different now. Not power, not patience, but absence. The phone stopped ringing. The envelope pickup stopped arriving. Even Nino stopped showing up every morning. One day, Stefano sat alone at his desk for 9 straight hours. No knocks, no calls, no movement in the house. He walked to the front window and looked out. And for the first time in over 40 years, the street felt indifferent to him. Not afraid, not hateful, just done. That night, Nino returned. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like a man who'd run a marathon and didn't win anything at the end. Stefano poured him a drink. They sat in the dark. Nino didn't speak at first. Then, he said, "They're coming after everyone, Zio." Stefano nodded. "I know. They hit Arturo's place. They froze the Ontario accounts. And Salvatore's godson, he turned informant. He's wearing a wire." Stefano closed his eyes. For a moment, the weight pressed in. But then, he whispered, "Maybe it's time to bury it." Nino blinked. "What? All of it? You want to run?" "No." Stefano opened his eyes. "I want to shut it down, piece by piece, before they take it from us like thieves in the night. If I end it, I keep the story mine." That was the new plan. Not survival, not expansion, not revenge, but control. Even in the fall, like a general burning his own city before the enemy could wave their flag over it. Over the next 2 weeks, Stefano took steps no one expected. He closed 3 of the funeral homes, liquidated old accounts, called in the final favors from Canada, silent ones, ones made decades ago, burned all ledgers, records, photographs, gave sealed envelopes to Nino with instructions on who gets what, cash, properties, documents. He even signed over the deed to the Niagara Street parlor to the church, donated it in full, tax-deductible, legal, clean. By July, it was done. The empire that had once stretched from Buffalo to Toronto, from dusty Sicilian graves to American courtrooms, from blood-soaked butcher shops to polished mahogany coffins, was over. By Stefano's hand, not theirs. One night, as the city lights blinked like dying stars in the window, Nino stood beside him. He didn't understand it. "You could have fought." "I did. You could have stayed in power. Power's a knife. The longer you hold it, the more it bleeds you." "Then what's left?" Stefano lit a cigarette. Inhaled. Exhaled. Then he said, "A man's last gift is deciding how the world forgets him." The house was quieter now than it had ever been. No footsteps, no phones, no voices, not even the old clock ticking in the hall. Stefano Magaddino sat in the den, curtains drawn, cigarette smoldering in the ashtray beside him. The smoke didn't curl upward like it used to. It just hung there, heavy, still like the breath of a house waiting to die. He had stopped counting days. There was no more business, no more men to meet. The empire had been wound down like an old watch, dismantled gear by gear, with no fanfare and no warning. And yet, there was no peace in the quiet, only echoes. He sometimes walked the house at night, like a ghost, room to room, hand sliding along the wood paneling. He knew every creak, every cracked tile, every photo that hadn't been taken off the wall in 30 years. There were pictures of men who were all dead now, weddings, baptisms, funerals. Some had betrayed him. Some he had buried. Some he had loved. All of them were gone. He stopped one night in front of a photo of Peter, his son, his blood, the boy who had thought he could run faster than history. Peter was smiling in the photo, hair slicked back, hand on his young wife's shoulder. The world hadn't touched him yet. Stefano stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "I didn't want to, but you left me no choice." His voice cracked on the word choice. He reached for the frame, hesitated, and left it on the wall. The trial never came. The federal indictment fizzled. Teddy Greco, the star witness, died in a car crash just 3 weeks before the hearing. The timing? Convenient. The FBI? Furious. But without Teddy, the rest of the case collapsed under weak testimonies and outdated evidence. Stefano walked free, legally, but not really. Because the streets knew, the families knew, even the priests knew. Stefano hadn't escaped justice, he had just outlived it. Nino came to visit once a week now. always on Sunday, always dressed in a dark suit, always bringing wine or fruit or some excuse to sit without making it seem like he was checking in on an old man waiting for death. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen, Nino finally said what they had both been thinking. "Do you think it mattered?" Stefano didn't answer right away. He poured them both a drink. The bottle made a soft glug in the glass. The kitchen light hummed above. "What we built," Nino continued, "the way we lived, the things we did. Did it change anything?" Stefano looked down at his glass. "It gave order to chaos, that's all it was ever meant to do," Nino nodded. "But the world doesn't want order now." "No," Stefano agreed. "It wants speed, noise, apologies." "Do you regret any of it?" Stefano took a sip, then said, without flinching, "No." Another pause. Then he added, "But I regret who I had to become to do it." That night, Stefano wrote a letter. The first in years. Not to Nino, not to the courts, not to the press, but to his grandson, Charles, the boy who had once brought shame to the family name in a nightclub, who had since moved out west, trying to forget who he came from. Stefano didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer advice. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs, mostly memories, small ones. Watching Charles eat peaches in the backyard as a child, carrying him into church on Sundays. The way his laugh used to bounce off the walls before the family turned heavy with fear. At the end, he wrote, "I don't know if you remember me as anything more than a shadow. Maybe that's all I ever was, but I never forgot you. You carry my name, even if the world tells you not to. Be something that lives longer than fear. That's all I ask." He sealed the letter, didn't put a return address, just signed it. S. That same week, Stefano went back to the cemetery. First time in almost a year. The air was cold but clean. Leaves scattered like old confessions across the ground. He wore his black coat, same one he'd worn to Peter's funeral, same one he'd worn to Salvatore's, same one he would be buried in. He walked slowly, knees aching, back stiff, until he found the spot. 3 headstones. His wife, his son. A blank one with just the last name, Magaddino. Reserved, waiting. He stood there for a long time. Then he took off his hat, and for the first time in his life, he prayed out loud. Not in Italian, not in Latin, just in a cracked, quiet English. "If there's anything left of me when I go, don't let it be fear. Let it be structure. Let it be a warning." Then he sat down on the bench beside the grave and smoked in silence. The city kept moving. New faces rose. New crews tried to reclaim territory. They didn't last. Buffalo had changed too much. The new men were loud, sloppy, too connected to technology, too disconnected from loyalty. The federal government knew them before their own lieutenants did. And Stefano? He watched them crash one by one. Sometimes he smiled, not out of pride, but out of pity. They were playing a game with no understanding of the rules. He stopped answering his door by autumn, stopped shaving, stopped eating much, stopped speaking. Nino still came, still checked in, still left wine on the counter and talked about weather and sports and politics like any of it mattered. But Stefano didn't say much back, because what else was there to say? The empire was gone. The name was dying. And he had chosen to outlive it, not because he wanted to, but because no one else could carry the coffin. The final photo ever taken of Stefano Magaddino was snapped by a newspaper photographer who had been following Nino from church. It shows Stefano standing on the front steps of his home, a long black coat, hands folded, eyes straight ahead, not smiling, not scowling, just watching like he always had. The caption read, "Last King of Buffalo, still standing, still silent." The photo was never published. It was kept in the archives, but Nino got a copy and framed it, put it in the chapel above the old altar where Stefano used to light candles for men he had buried. No name under it, just the image, just the presence. The body starts to go first, not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse. It just loosens. Little things. The pain in the knees every time you stand, the way your fingers take longer to curl, the way sleep becomes thin like a window left open too long. Stefano Magaddino didn't fear death. He had met it too many times, spoken to it. Handed it names, carried it into alleys and churches and boardrooms. But he did feel something else. Not dread, just readiness. He stopped waking at dawn, stopped dressing in full, stopped shaving. The mirrors in the house had been covered for weeks now, not with black cloth, this wasn't a funeral, but with old bed sheets taped at the corners. He didn't want to look anymore. There was nothing left to see. Not the legend, not the king, not the man who built an empire from the grave up. Now, he was just what was left behind. Nino still came, though even he had begun to look at Stefano differently, not with pity. Worse, with gentleness. That same soft voice you give to a man you know doesn't have many more Sundays left. He brought food still, brought the paper, told stories from the neighborhoods, who got arrested, who was running what, who was pretending to be important now. Stefano listened, sometimes nodded, sometimes grunted, but he no longer answered with plans, with instructions, with that silent nod that meant, handle it. That man was gone. Now there was only this one, sitting in the same chair, wrapped in a coat, eyes flickering toward the window every few minutes, as if he was waiting for someone who'd been late for years. One day, Nino sat down at the table and placed a photograph between them. They found this in the archives. I thought you should see it. Stefano blinked slowly, picked up the photo. It was old, faded, a black and white shot of Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, before the wars, before the blood, when the world was still quiet. There was a church in the background, a boy walking beside a donkey, laundry hanging across windows like flags. Stefano stared at it, and for the first time in years, he spoke. My brother died 3 streets from there. Nino looked at him, surprised. He hadn't heard the story before. Stefano didn't elaborate, didn't offer the memory, just stared, then whispered, I told him not to go out that night. He placed the photo down, gently, like it might break. Later that night, Stefano stood at the window for the last time. The city outside wasn't the one he ruled, but it was still his. Even if it didn't remember him, even if the people walking below had no idea whose name had once meant silence, fear, and structure, even if all of it had passed on like breath into winter air. He touched the glass and whispered, I was here. That was all. The final decline began in late October. It started with the hands. He couldn't hold a glass without trembling. Then, the chest, shallow breaths, quick fatigue. Then came the coughing fits, the blood. He didn't tell anyone, not even Nino. He knew what it was, didn't need a doctor to tell him. He'd seen death too many times not to recognize the knock at the door. Instead, he prepared. Not out of desperation, but out of order. He went through old drawers, burned old letters, destroyed old notes, tossed old photographs into the fire, not out of shame, but out of control. He didn't want the world to piece him together after he was gone. Let the stories conflict, let the myths fracture, let the city decide what he was. But they wouldn't have his truth. That belonged only to him. Then he wrote one last note. Short, 2 lines. I walked beside the devil, and he feared me too. Let the flowers rot. Don't pretend I was kind. He sealed it in an envelope, left it on the kitchen table. The last time Nino came, Stefano didn't meet him at the door. The house was quiet, dark. Nino entered, calling softly. He found him in the den, same chair, same coat. Still, eyes closed, peaceful, no blood, no mess, just gone. Like a man who had finally reached the last name on the list. The funeral was private, not because there weren't people who wanted to come, but because most of them were gone. A few old faces, some younger men who had only heard stories, 1 or 2 priests who remembered the envelopes tucked beneath altar cloths in the 1930s. No family, no grandchildren, no sons, no daughters, only Nino. He made sure Stefano was buried in the same plot he had stood over all those years, next to his wife, next to Peter, next to the name Magaddino, the Undertaker, buried by the last man who still knew what that name meant. The city moved on. Buffalo had elections, arrests, scandals. Another family rose, then fell. Another name got whispered, then erased. Bars opened where funerals used to be planned. Churches became apartments. Bodies turned to dust. But once a year, on the anniversary, Nino would walk to that grave, leave a black lily, and whisper, "They forgot you." Then smile faintly and add, "But I didn't." The stone was simple, no golden trim. No dramatic epitaph, just a name, 2 dates, and a symbol carved small into the corner. Magaddino, October 10th, 1891, July 19th, 1974, a single black lily etched in the corner. The cemetery sat quiet on the outskirts of Buffalo, where the wind moved slow and the trees leaned like they were still listening to old stories. Most people passed the stone without looking. The newer graves were shinier, crowded with names from wars, professions, beloved sons and fathers and wives. Stefano's grave sat off to the side, not forgotten, just left behind, which perhaps was fitting. Because Stefano Magaddino had never needed to be in the spotlight. He had been the man in the back room, the voice on the other end of the silence, the final decision carved into a casket. And now, he rested exactly where he belonged, in the quiet. Nino still came once a year. He didn't bring flowers. Stefano had made it clear. Don't pretend I was kind. Instead, Nino brought a cigar, a folded newspaper, and a small bottle of red wine. He'd sit on the bench near the grave and speak low, not out of reverence, but out of ritual. He talked about the city. They're turning the old bar on Niagara into condos now. Everything's glass. You'd hate it. The feds locked up Luca Brevetti last year. Fraud. That's what gets him now. They still whisper your name in the East Side. Just the old ones. And once he was done, he'd place the cigar on the corner of the grave, uncork the bottle, pour a splash onto the grass, and drink the rest himself. Not as a toast, as a memory. There were no documentaries made, no movies, no retrospectives. The world didn't clamor to tell Stefano Magaddino's story. He wasn't the flashy one. He didn't die in a hail of bullets or turn rat on national television. He just disappeared. And somehow, that made him even more permanent, because real power doesn't go out with applause. It fades slowly until it becomes part of the walls. But there were still traces, small ones. A priest who still kept a list of baptismal donations with no names attached, all from the 1940s. A butcher in South Buffalo who told his grandson, "There used to be a man, you didn't cross him, he buried problems, literally." A photo in a barbershop, worn from decades of sun, a black and white image of a man in a long coat standing in front of a funeral parlor. No name, no date. But every old man who saw it nodded slowly, like they understood something the kids never would. And that was the legacy. Not the bodies, not the cash, but the code. Stefano Magaddino had lived by it until his last breath. No names, no noise, no mercy for betrayal, no loyalty without consequence, and above all, never outlive your silence. The world had moved on. Organized crime had become something else. Rackets turned into lobbying, guns became lawyers, respect turned into Instagram followers and podcasts about alpha males and mob mentality. The new generation talked too much, posted too much, wanted the glow of the gun without the weight of the grave. Stefano would have scoffed, would have lit a cigarette, walked past, and waited for their obituary to print. Because he knew the truth. You don't build empires out of bullets. You build them out of decisions. And you don't last long in this world unless you're willing to let your own blood run cold. When Nino passed in the late 80s, he was buried beside Stefano. Not because it was planned, but because after all the wars, betrayals, and broken bonds, Nino had been the only one who never left. The Undertaker and the soldier. The mind and the hand. One gave the orders. The other made sure they were never forgotten. Years later, A young historian from Buffalo University was digging through state archives. She was looking for information about union corruption in the 50s. Instead, she found a sealed envelope with an old FBI memo. Subject: Stefano Magaddino, internal profile, classified 1958. Subject remains elusive, calculating, never uses telephones, speaks sparingly, controls region with fear and respect, known to quote scripture and operate out of funeral homes. We believe he is the most structurally disciplined organized crime figure in the Northeast. She read it twice, then wrote it on a note card. She later told her professor, "I found the blueprint for control, and it wasn't loud. It was surgical." But the world didn't ask for that story. They wanted fireworks, not foundations. So it stayed where it belonged, in the quiet. In a backroom poker game in Niagara Falls, an old man once told a younger player, "You know why the city still breathes? Because there was once a man who made sure every beat was accounted for. No one moved without his permission, and when he died, the city sighed like it had been holding its breath for 60 years. "What was his name?" the kid asked. The old man smiled. "You don't speak it? Why not? Because if you do, you better mean it." That was Stefano's legacy. Not fame, not monuments, not even fear. Just a standard, a code, a reminder that there was once a time when a name could move cities and bury them just the same. And in the quiet wind that cuts across Buffalo in winter, if you stand still enough, you might hear it. Not a voice, not a threat, just a presence, still watching, still waiting, still reminding the world what happens when the grave learns to speak.